Hey, and welcome to another VR benchmark video. Today, we're going to be looking at the upscale mode for the Crystal, both the Lite and the original here. This is an idea most of you are probably quite familiar with from flat screen gaming, where you render something at a lower internal resolution and then upscale it back to a higher output. In theory, this gets you a good balance of image quality and performance. In fact, there are already a few popular community tools, such as the long depreciated OpenXR toolkit and VR Perf kit, which inject methods like FSR into the game that do exactly this. But Pimax have decided to try and bake this into their runtime, as with how higher resolution headsets are aiming to render now, just look at this rather horrifying number the Crystal has by default, something like upscaling or foveated rendering can help mitigate such scary numbers. Now, a good enough upscaling algorithm can do an amazing job at improving performance for a mild to sometimes even near invisible visual penalty. Here's an example of the current industry golden standard, DLSS at 4K in Hogwarts Legacy with quality, upscaling from 66%, and performance upscaling from 50% versus native. And that's per axis scaling, so performance is rendering at 1080p. The shadows have noticeably more artifacting, but considering the far lower internal res, it's actually holding up decently, and quality mode sometimes trades blows with native. Worse in some areas, but maybe even a little bit better in others. However, not all algorithms are created equal, which is why we're going to take a look at both the performance and visual quality of Pimax's implementation today to see if it's actually worth using. Before getting into any benchmarks though, I have to make one very important note about how VR rendering and this whole process works. Now, the Crystal has 2880 by 2880 panels, yet that number I showed just a minute ago is much higher resolution. Well, the reason for that is because the VR rendering pipeline has to accommodate for pre-distorting and warping the image to counteract the distortion caused by the lenses, known as pincushion distortion, and this merits rendering above panel resolution since that extra resolution buffer can help mitigate various artifacts caused by the warping, such as chromatic aberration, among other things. However, this does not mean that your clarity is destroyed the moment you drop below 100% resolution, because despite this, VR isn't a flat screen monitor where something like uneven integer scalings without upscaling, such as say rendering 1440p on a 4K monitor, since 1440p's resolution does not evenly fit into 4K, unlike 1080p, can be where that can become a real problem. The final image displayed on the headset is, in this case, still a 2880 by 2880 per eye signal, because that's what the displays physically are. But you still benefit from rendering above that, as despite being downfed into that limit, there's still more information to work with. If you want to see this in practice yourself and have an NVIDIA card, go launch a game with DLAA support and give it a try, because that works on a similar-ish idea of over-rendering. It's not an exact comparison, but it's the easiest non-VR example I can think of to illustrate this. 100% in VR is just generally defined as the manufacturer's recommended resolution, but it's not an ironclad rule. To use this headset as an example, yes, there is a visual hit when downsampling versus default 4312 by 5100 per eye, and I really do not advise going down to panel res. But speaking on sharpness, my Crystal here looks far better than my Quest 3 or PSVR 2 when set to a similar resolution because of the physically higher res displays, though it's not a one-to-one comparison given the different lenses. This brings me to Pimax's upscaling technique. What's going on here is instead of sending a 2880 by 2880 per eye signal to the headset, it instead sends a 2160 by 2160 per eye signal, and then it upscales that to the display resolution. This is why Pimax used these numbers in their announcement of the upscaling tech, despite the fact that the render resolution in SteamVR is so much higher than that. And don't just take Pimax's word for it. The big screen beyond does a similar thing at 90 Hz mode, where a 1920 by 1920 signal is an upscale to match the HMD's 2560 by 2560 per eye displays. Upscaling is not display stream compression though, like Big Screen tried to lie about and gaslight everyone about before. Very different things. Anyway, that all said, VR rendering is really a fascinating topic that I can't properly cover in this brief segment, as this is meant to be more of a benchmark and visual quality video. So for anyone who'd like a much more in-depth look at the topic, I'll link an old video from a GDC talk by Alex Vlachos, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who worked with Valve and Meta. It'll be timestamped to the relevant part about rendering above panel res down in the description. It's old, and certain aspects of the talk, particularly on numbers like the PPD issue, they don't really apply as strongly now, but still a good watch for the curious. That out of the way, we're going to look at the performance first, since I think it's what most people are interested in. Today, we're going to be looking at both the SteamVR and native OpenXR implementation from Pimax, as their most recent update promised some improvements in OpenXR I do want to take a look at. The test system is a 7950X3D CPU, affinity mask to run the game on Vcache cores only, RTX 4090 GPU, 64GB of 6000MHz CL30 DDR6 RAM, and then tested firstly at 4312 by 5100 per eye, or the high res in the Pimax software, and then 3232 by 3824 per eye, or medium in the Pimax software. This is also, coincidentally, the final output res of the upscale mode when set to high res, so it makes for a very interesting comparison point on performance and quality. I also tested a 3080 Ti mobile set, but I didn't have time to fit it into this video without blowing the runtime to check out every single game, and I didn't want to just check out one from that system. So I'll be including a link to the charts for that in a pinned comment in this video down below if anyone wants to see how a more mid-ish range GPU performs, since that's comparable to about desktop 3070 or so. For simplicity and clarification's sake, with the disclaimer I just gave about VR render res, when I say native res in this video, I mean running it without the upscaler function. Also going to be looking at the frame time plots. These do not stop at the exact same spot, but as I had to manually stop each benchmark run and I could not see how long it was inside my headset with my software, it was kind of difficult to stop at the exact second, but I reran all my tests to ensure everything fell within no more than a 3 to 4 second difference. Most were only just 1 to 2, so the gap may look larger than it actually is. This out of the way, let's get to testing.
First up is a new addition to the testing suite and recent big VR release, Metro Awakening. I have a lot to talk about with this game, as it shows a great example of how performance can be impacted by resolution due to its high usage of dynamic lights, which is something that gets very costly as you increase res, and because it helps me prove a very specific point about Pimax's OpenXR runtime. Looking at full resolution, the 4090 just cannot keep up in any capacity. The performance is just unacceptably low. However, there are some shockingly huge margins between the two runtimes even here. SteamVR is doing around 12% better on average FPS, 28% better with the 1% low, and leads by 31% in the 0.1% low. It may only be a couple FPS because of how damn low the standards are, but these margins are important to know, as when looking at the upscale medium res, we see a rather interesting trend. The performance delta with SteamVR via medium res or upscaling at high, both perform roughly identically, is massive, way out of line with the change in resolution versus high res. There is a 130% increase in average FPS from 36 to 84. The lows rise by an even higher margin, going from 23.88 FPS on the 1% low all the way up to as high as 62.45. That's a 161% leap, but margins grow even more with the 0.1% low, which go all the way from 21 FPS to about 58. We're looking at an up to 170% improvement from dropping the resolution by not even half. This is going from literally unplayable to actually a pretty great experience that's even lightly hertz limited in my benchmark scene. But these same margins are not observed with the native OpenXR runtime. The average FPS rises to match SteamVR's, but the lows are horrific. Taking the best performing upscale run, the lows are both about 74 to 75% better than native res. In fact, installing the old Pimax XR runtime, while it still falls a good bit short of performance with SteamVR, the margins narrow somewhat, as it's doing around 30% better on the 1% low, and it is 33% improved on the 0.1% low from Pimax's native OpenXR runtime. So you might think this is a clear open and shut, just use SteamVR, and Pimax has to work a lot on their OXR runtime since it's a recent feature, right? Well, yes. But it's also a lot more complicated than that, and we have to dig into the frame time plot to help understand why, because it's not really that simple. As can be seen here, SteamVR's frame time consistency is relatively good. There are some points with spikes, but the flatter a frame time graph, the better it is, because it means there is a consistent time between frames, where lower is better since it's delivering the frame to the HMD faster. Let me explain why that consistency matters though, as raw frames per second may not tell the full story. Let's take 60 FPS. Ideally, you would want each frame to be delivered in 1/60th of a second. But if you just look at the FPS graphs, well, in theory, you could have something like a single frame delivered in 59/60ths of a second. Then you have the remaining 59 frames all delivered in 1/60th of a second. That'd still be an average FPS of 60, but it would feel terrible and appear choppy due to the inconsistent frame timing. And showing the native Pimax OpenXR runtime, this problem can be seen quite clearly. At multiple points in the run, the frame time gets incredibly inconsistent, pinging between high and low in a way which does feel bad in the headset. However, take note of how at several points, the overall frame time consistency actually gets pretty comparable to SteamVR. If we add in Pimax XR, we can see it has some similar issues, but at some very key points, such as around 65 seconds to 125, Pimax XR does a significantly better job of avoiding the as extreme inconsistency as a native OXR does. Yes, I did say lower is better on frame time, so one might think it not spiking down and only up is bad, but remember that 59 frames in 1/60th of a second example. If the consistency is bad, as Pimax's is, then that is a big problem. But there's yet more to elaborate on for why this happens with Pimax's native OpenXR runtime, as I think I found why. I've lined up two graphs here to compare SteamVR and Pimax's native OpenXR runtime. The bottom is the frame time plot just seen, while the above chart represents the average FPS throughout the run. The two runtimes are quite comparable and trade blows, with one better than the other in various points. But take a very special note of how the frame time chart is when we hit a stable 90 FPS average. The most obvious parts are at roughly 10 to 25 seconds and 125 seconds to the end. The frame times are actually quite good and solid, competitive with SteamVR even. But if we look at, well, almost any other part of the chart where we don't have 90 FPS, the consistency is in the dumpster. There's this very tiny fluctuation in 90 FPS at about 100 seconds where the frame time turns normal before going back to spiky that I think further illustrates this. What I believe is happening is that as long as you can meet your headset's target frame rate, the runtime is able to maintain good frame pacing and function properly. But unlike SteamVR, Pimax's native OpenXR runtime just does not know how to deal with frame rate dips of any kind and kind of freaks out the moment they occur. To further prove my point, I want to go back to FPS charts. Here, I massively lowered my resolution to the low quality in Pimax Play in order to try and avoid as many frame dips as possible, while also using the software's built-in FPS limiter to lock my FPS to half at higher resolutions. If we compare medium res lock to 45 FPS versus 90, the 1% low has risen by 11%, but the 0.1% low is 18% better uncapped. So might be onto something, but nothing conclusive here. However, if we compare the low resolution results where I was profoundly hertz limited, the margin on 1% low between SteamVR and Pimax's native OpenXR runtime is far smaller, with Steam having only a 6% advantage here. Pimax's native OpenXR runtime is lagging behind a lot more noticeably on the 0.1% low, but Steam is only ahead by about 25% here, whereas at medium res, it led by about 75%. If we go back to the frame time plot real quick, the medium res runs are lining up with the inconsistent as hell trend seen, but the low res runs, it can be seen that SteamVR and Pimax's native OpenXR runtimes have very competitive frame time plots, though Steam is still slightly ahead. I saw this trend happen with some other games I tried that got close to 90 Hz, so I don't believe it's a raw performance issue and more the runtime doesn't know what to do if you can't maintain a near locked 90 FPS or whatever mode you've set your Hertz to. If you can do that though, then Pimax's native OpenXR runtime can work perfectly fine, and if you are using it, you may not need to tune it as much as one might think. But this video would be 2 hours long if I did this analysis for every game on the list, so I will be sticking to the FPS FPS and frame time plots for the rest. Just keep this in mind with respect to Pimax's OpenXR performance right now. This kind of stuff is why VR benchmarking is hell. Might make a separate video on that. And now we have MSFS 2020 on DX12 because my system doesn't work as well with DX11 in this game, and 2024 is still a disaster. Maybe I'll move to that next video. Running at the high resolution option, performance is generally unplayably low, but after Metro's results seeing the 1% low near identical and native OpenXR having actually a 5% average better FPS advantage, it's a little surprising. However, Steam VR's 0.1% low are significantly better with a 33% advantage. Steam VR and native OpenXR, once again, perform with similar trends as with Metro, where Steam VR is actually functioning properly, with better paced lows, and native OpenXR is showing some real inconsistency. But upscaling or downsampling native perform the same within each runtime. Compared to full resolution and looking at Steam, we're seeing up to 69% improvement on average FPS, plus 59% on the 1% low, and then plus 51% on the 0.1% low. We're actually at the point where 45 FPS reprojection to 90 could be viable with a tiny bit more tweaking, but the relative margins are vastly smaller than Metro Awakening had. Still, the native OpenXR runtime exhibits the same issues as before, but I brought Pimax XR in once more to help illustrate the point. So let's take a look at the 3 upscale runs. Pimax XR is ahead of Steam VR by about 5 to 8%, small margins, but every last frame can matter in VR, and this is also consistent with prior tests I've ran. Compared to the native Pimax OXR runtime, average FPS is identical, but lows and frame pacing are where Pimax's native one falters badly. Pimax XR's 1% low are a staggering 55% better, while the 0.1% low lead by a slightly smaller 52% margin. We've jumped from the high 20s to low 40s on these metrics. If we move over to the frame time plot, basically the same story as Metro. Pimax XR and Steam VR are quite competitive, while the former just slightly edges out the latter, represented by the lows. Pimax's native OXR runtime just has really awful frame pacing issues. It's not that good inside the HMD because things just feel a bit shuddery and off in a way that's hard to exactly describe unless you experience it yourself. Interestingly though, if we check out the native res, while Pimax's native OpenXR is still a decent bit more inconsistent than Steam VR, relatively speaking, the spikes are nowhere near as bad as at the lower resolution. However, it's of little matter beyond academics since average FPS is still hovering around 31, which is a miserable experience, but still interesting behavior. Next up is a demanding UE5 title, Riven. Like with MSFS, the average FPS and 1% low at high resolution are quite comparable between Steam VR and the native OpenXR, but the 0.1% low with Steam is a near 30% better. Not that it's the best experience anyway with these low frames. Moving on to the other test, the upscale test with Steam actually had meaningfully better 0.1% low, being about 9% up from simply downsampling the resolution, but the other metrics are within run-to-run variance. Next to high resolution, there are some quite massive improvements though. Average FPS jumps from 41 to 70, roughly plus 68%, while the lows increase by greater margins, with the 1% low shooting up 73, and the 0.1% low absolutely skyrocketing by up to 86%. Still nowhere near Metro Awakening, but a pretty massive leap that I'd say feels decently playable now. With native OpenXR, both upscale and medium res perform about identically, not much to say. But considering the other game results so far, native OpenXR is, relatively speaking, not as far behind. If we just compare the two upscale runs as they were the best from each, native OpenXR leads by 5% on average FPS, while Steam is ahead on 1% low by only 15%. Though the 0.1% low, it wins by a higher 29% margin. Those are definitely better, but are the smaller margins reflected in the frame times as well? The answer to that is holy hell no. Compared to Steam VR, the problems are present as ever since we simply aren't meeting the target frame rate. So despite not being that far behind on pure FPS numbers, the overall consistency and frame pacing is lacking, and it ain't a good feeling inside the headset. This is a significant reason why relying on pure FPS numbers alone is even worse for VR, because low latency and responsiveness is even more important than it is with flat screen. The much flatter line of Steam VR feels better if you're at all sensitive to inconsistent frame pacing. And now we have Resident Evil Village VR mod on the beta Upscaler branch, running mostly max settings and then some which need to be disabled for the mod to function. Using DLAA because otherwise I was actually 2 Hz limited to do a good job of illustrating the performance gap. No native OpenXR runtime as the game simply would not start with it selected, so SteamVR only, and we can make this quick. Overall, much of the same trend, so not much to talk about. The upscale mode and then downsampling native have identical performance, but some meaningful gains are still shown over full resolution. However, the margins are the smallest so far. Average FPS increases by up to 60%, the 1% low rise by nearly 51%, while the 0.1% low rise is a smaller 44%. These may not be the biggest margins, but in absolute terms, it is a far smoother experience than playing at full res without any upscaling. And with a few tweaks, such as slightly lowering settings or disabling DLAA, it'd be very possible to have an excellent and solid 90 FPS experience at a reasonably good resolution. Closing things out, we have Skyrim with the December 14th update of Mad God's Overhaul. This uses a customized version of OpenComposite for OpenXR. Comparing high res, it's the only game which saw OpenXR performance rise with higher FPS all around, with an around 11% increase in average FPS, a near 18% rise and 0.1% low. The 1% low are within a few percent run-to-run variance, but we're off to a promising start. However, this does not hold when comparing much higher frame rates with the Upscaler or at medium res. Comparing OpenComposite to SteamVR, average FPS rises by 7 to 8% versus downsampling native, but only has a 5% lead versus the Upscaler. As expected, the lows are where SteamVR pulls quite ahead. SteamVR, with the Upscaler, is seeing 40% better 1% low and actually getting over 60 FPS. Quite important if one wanted to maintain proper motion smoothing at 120 Hz mode. The 0.1% low aren't as improved, only 28% better, but that's still the expected trend. If we compare the SteamVR runtimes as those function properly, going from native res to the Upscaler gives us plus 63% and a similar but smaller increase on the 1% low of plus 58%. However, the 0.1% low saw an absolutely transformative increase of plus 113%, the largest margins in the whole video behind Metro Awakening. And the increase from 24 to over 50 FPS means that the 0.1% low with medium native res and then the Upscaler are higher than the average FPS is at high resolution native. It is a demonstrably better experience inside the headset. The Upscale is also technically performing better than downsampling native res, but it's a few percent difference, so that's within variance. If we go over to the frame time plot and compare the Upscale runs, since they were the best, this shows one of the more interesting things that I believe strongly supports my theory. In the about first third or so, OpenComposite's frame time plot is noticeably worse than SteamVR's, but as time goes on and I get to lighter sections of the run that can actually hit a stable 90, things start to level out and trade some blows, but where there are points, notably about 40 to 50 seconds, where OpenComposite actually does better than SteamVR. This said, these margins are still incredibly small, and we're looking at a difference of a few milliseconds versus the 10 to 15 earlier. So I'd say it's unlikely most people would notice, but I certainly felt the difference between the first and second half with that much smoother frame time plot inside the HMD. And the point is that as long as you can maintain a very stable frame rate matching your target refresh rate, Pimax's native OpenXR behaves just fine. It's essentially good until it's not. And just to briefly look at high res, since OpenComposite did better, we can see it's not reflected in this frame time stability. OpenComposite doesn't spike up as much and indeed does spend a good bit at lower frame times, but it's overall rather inconsistent, and that manifested as feeling a bit more stuttery in the headset, so not recommended. But it is still interesting to see the inconsistency is more towards going below SteamVR than, well, everywhere like some of the other games in higher FPS.
So, there's all the performance metrics. Now, let's talk about the visual quality before we give overall conclusions, because I can make this very brief for two simple reasons. Firstly, you remember what I said about 2160 by 2160 signal versus a 2880 by 2881? Well, that means in the recording and stuff like the desktop mirror or the eye capture, it kind of screws with the visual quality of the upscale mode for comparative purposes, and between having to go through multiple layers of compression with recording, re-encoding the video after editing, and then uploading to YouTube, it just didn't really paint the accurate picture of how things are in the headset, even when simply comparing native versus downsampling, especially given it cannot account for the lenses, and it makes it look like a far smaller difference than it truly was. Never mind actually trying to find high enough quality assets I could get close to and record in the exact same spot so my distance from it didn't screw with the comparisons. This is one example I took in Kayak VR, and anyone with a Crystal can just test native res versus downsampling. This doesn't do the difference justice. It's only really good for showing the difference in shimmer and nothing else. So I hope you can just take my word for it on the visual quality, especially when this sentiment has been echoed by several other people I've talked to who've done similar comparisons when I say that the upscale mode is nearly identical to just simply downsampling native res. In fact, I'd actually say it's even a tiny bit sharper to simply downsample to the same output res. I went through a bunch of games looking at various assets and even the test HMD eye chart, but it was the same story every single time, unfortunately. So then, what's the takeaway from all this? Well, unfortunately, it's not very good. I think the upscale idea is great in concept. I've gotten some good results in VR and flat screen using various forms of upscaling, but in practice, this one is just... It's useless. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, and there's not a single case I could recommend it. Performance and visual quality is essentially identical to just downsampling from native res. It's locked to 90 Hz, whereas native can also use 72 or 120 Hz. It just takes more time to switch to, given the need to restart the headset and Steam, which makes it less convenient. I get what Pimax is trying to do here, but it just needs some further refinement. This ain't it in its current state. Maybe some sharpening would help. It needs to either perform better than simply downsampling for similar visual quality, or look better without performing significantly worse in order to be worth it. And it's just neither of those, unfortunately. If you need to gain performance, just downsample your res instead of use the upscaler. I still like to avoid dropping res if I can help it, but you can get around plus 60 to 70% or so performance dropping to medium res, and there may be outlier cases like Metro where you see well over 2.5 times better performance and things still look reasonably good. Some effects just really hurt as resolution goes up. Now, concerning Pimax's OpenXR implementation though, I think things are a little bit more optimistic, even if that's still gonna need some work. I wouldn't recommend it right now unless you've already tuned your performance to avoid, well, almost any frame drops, because Pimax OpenXR runtime seems to be a case of it's suddenly fine until it's not, with nothing in between, rather than saying needing to drop settings enough to get plus 60% performance with those lows. And if you do try to avoid any frame drops at all, you may not actually need to adjust it as much as you might think, given the average FPS in Steam VR was higher in some cases, but it was still incredibly small margins by only about 5% or so, so I really just recommend sticking with Steam VR. Until I hear any kind of update about Pimax's OpenXR solution though, this will probably be the last time I take a look at it for a while because of this issue. And there's the video. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching, and consider subscribing to stick around and see what I do next. Probably gonna have some stuff on the Crystal Super and the 5090 with those coming out soon, assuming I can get them. And if not, maybe I'll see you again in the recommended sometime. Later!